The handcuffs bit into Valentina Viper, Kozlov's wrists as she sat rigid in the metal chair, her weathered flight jacket draped awkwardly around her shoulders. The military police officers flanking her wore expressions of barely contained disgust, their eyes lingering on the faded trident pin adorning her collar, a symbol they believed she had no right to wear. The interrogation room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her angular face, highlighting the thin scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, a souvenir from a mission most people weren't cleared to know existed. "Ma'am, we need you to explain how you came into possession of that insignia," Staff Sergeant Morrison said, his voice thick with condescension. He leaned forward, pointing at the silver pin that caught the sterile light. "Because according to our records, no woman has ever completed SEAL training, and certainly not someone claiming to be a pilot." Valentina's gray eyes remained fixed on a spot just above his shoulder, her breathing controlled and measured. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful weapon in an interrogation. The arrest had been swift and humiliating, dragged from a veterans bar in San Diego, where she'd been nursing a whiskey and watching coverage of the latest overseas conflict with the detached interest of someone who had seen too much. "The pin is authentic," she finally said, her voice carrying the faint accent of her Ukrainian grandmother, softened by decades in American airspace. "I earned it." The younger MP, Corporal Hayes, snorted. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States." He gestured toward her flight jacket, nodding the array of patches and ribbons that told a story few would believe. "Look, lady, we appreciate your service, whatever it actually was, but stolen valor is a serious offense." Before Valentina could respond, the door opened with a sharp click. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as a figure in dress whites entered, his shoulders bearing the 4 stars of a full admiral. The MPs immediately snapped to attention, their faces draining of color as they recognized Admiral Jonathan Steele Hawthorne, a legend whose reputation preceded him into any room he entered. His weathered face, marked by decades of salt spray and difficult decisions, surveyed the scene with calculating blue eyes. He took in the handcuffed woman, the nervous MPs, and finally his gaze settled on the small silver pin that had caused such commotion. For a long moment, the room held its breath. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of classified operations and buried secrets. "That mark is real." The trident pin seemed to gleam brighter under the harsh lights, as if awakened by recognition from someone who understood its true significance. Morrison's mouth opened slightly, confusion replacing his earlier certainty, while Hayes took an unconscious step backward. Valentina remained motionless, though something flickered behind her eyes, relief, perhaps, or vindication long overdue. The Admiral's presence had shifted the entire atmosphere, transforming what had been a routine case of suspected fraud into something far more complex and dangerous. Admiral Hawthorne moved closer to examine the pin, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched taut as he studied not just the insignia, but the woman wearing it. His eyes traced the scar on her face, noted the calluses on her hands visible despite the handcuffs, and recognized something in her bearing that spoke of missions that didn't officially exist. When he looked up, his gaze met hers directly for the first time, and in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them without words. "Release her," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. "Now." The MPs exchanged uncertain glances. Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, with respect, she was arrested for—" "I know exactly why she was arrested, Staff Sergeant," the Admiral interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made both younger men flinch. "And I'm telling you to release her. Immediately." He turned his attention back to Valentina, who was watching the exchange with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment to strike. "The handcuffs, Sergeant. Remove them." As the metal restraints fell away, Valentina rubbed her wrists slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She stood with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in a cockpit or underwater, her posture straightening despite her modest height. The Admiral gestured toward the door, a silent invitation that was more of a command. "We need to talk," he said simply. The corridor outside the interrogation room buzzed with activity, but it parted around the Admiral and his unlikely companion like water around a ship's bow. Valentina walked beside him, her flight boots echoing against the polished floors of the naval base. Personnel they passed stared openly, not just at the presence of such a high-ranking officer, but at the woman beside him who had somehow transformed from suspected fraud to someone deserving of his personal attention. 15 years, Admiral Hawthorne said as they walked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. 15 years since Operation Midnight Current. I wondered what happened to you after the extraction. I flew, Valentina replied simply, as if those two words explained everything. And perhaps, for someone who had lived their life in the spaces between official records and classified files, they did. They entered an elevator that required the Admiral's keycard, ascending to levels of the building that most personnel would never see. The silence between them was comfortable now, the silence of two people who had operated in shadows and understood the weight of secrets. When the doors opened, they stepped into a conference room with windows overlooking the harbor, where ships of various sizes and purposes rode at anchor in the afternoon sun. "Coffee?" the Admiral asked, moving toward a machine that looked military-issue but well-maintained. "I remember you took it black. Some things don't change." "Some things do," Valentina said, accepting the offered cup. She moved to the window, looking out at the water with eyes that had seen oceans from angles most people couldn't imagine. The world's gotten smaller, more connected, harder to disappear. "Is that what you were doing? Disappearing?" He joined her at the window, following her gaze to where a destroyer was making its way toward open water. "Because from what I heard through unofficial channels, you've been anything but invisible." Valentina's reflection in the glass showed a small smile, the first genuine expression she'd worn since her arrest. "Flying cargo runs in Afghanistan, medical supplies to refugee camps in Syria, nothing that would interest the Pentagon." "Everything interests the Pentagon these days," Admiral Hawthorne said, "especially when it involves someone with your particular skill set." He paused, studying her profile. "How's the shoulder?" Her left hand moved unconsciously to her right shoulder, where shrapnel from that long-ago mission had left its mark. "Flies fine in good weather, protests in the rain." She turned from the window to face him directly. "Why did you come, Admiral? That interrogation room was beneath your pay grade." "Because someone flagged your arrest in the system. Someone who remembered what you did off the coast of Somalia." His expression grew serious. "Someone who knows we might need you again." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Outside, seagulls wheeled around the harbor, their cries barely audible through the reinforced glass. Valentina set down her coffee cup and moved away from the window, packing to the far end of the conference room where maps and charts covered one wall. Her eyes swept across them automatically, processing tactical information with the instinctive efficiency of someone trained to see patterns in chaos. "The world's burning again," she said without turning around. "I can see it in the deployment schedules, feel it in the air traffic patterns. Whatever's coming, it's big enough to make you remember old ghosts." "Not ghosts," Admiral Hawthorne corrected. "Assets, proven assets with capabilities that can't be taught in any academy." He joined her at the map wall, pointing to a region marked in red. "What do you know about the South China Sea?" Valentina's finger traced a route across the chart, her movements precise despite the passage of years since her last official briefing. "Chinese expansion, artificial islands, naval posturing." She looked up at him. "And something that requires someone who can fly under the radar. Literally." "The situation has escalated beyond public knowledge," the Admiral said. "We have assets in place, but they need extraction. The kind of extraction that requires someone who can thread the needle between international waters and hostile airspace, someone who can adapt when plans go sideways, and someone expendable enough that their capture wouldn't embarrass anyone important," Valentina added dryly. "I assume my death certificate is already prepared, just in case." Admiral Hawthorne had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Your country needs you, Kozlov, again." She turned from the maps, her gray eyes searching his face for truth beneath the diplomatic language. "My country arrested me 2 hours ago for wearing insignia I bled for. My country has spent 15 years pretending I don't exist." Her voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "What makes you think I still consider it mine?" The question hit harder than she'd intended, and for a moment the Admiral looked older than his years. Outside, the destroyer had cleared the harbor and was picking up speed, its wake spreading behind it in a V-shaped pattern that would linger long after the ship itself had disappeared over the horizon. The sight seemed to remind both of them that some journeys, once begun, changed everything that followed. "Because you're still here," he said finally. "Still flying rescue missions instead of charter flights for rich tourists. Still wearing that pin even though it's caused you nothing but trouble." He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because 15 years ago, you saved 17 lives at the cost of your own career, and you've never once asked for recognition or reward." Valentina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously tracing the scar on her face. The room around them felt suspended in time, as if the weight of the decision before her had somehow slowed the normal flow of seconds and minutes. Through the window, she could see another ship preparing for departure, its crew moving with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that some missions were worth any risk. "The team," she said eventually. "The ones who need extraction, tell me about them." Admiral Hawthorne reached into his jacket and withdrew a tablet, its screen coming to life with classified information that would never appear in any official report. Photos of 3 individuals appeared, along with data that painted a picture of a mission gone critically wrong. Intelligence operatives, deep cover for 8 months. They were supposed to gather information about Chinese naval capabilities, but something went sideways. Last communication was 48 hours ago. Valentina studied the faces on the screen, committing them to memory with the same attention to detail that had once helped her identify targets from miles away. 2 men and a woman, all young enough to be her children, all wearing expressions that spoke of determination and naivety in equal measure. She had been their age once, before missions had taught her that survival often meant making choices that haunted you forever. "Extraction point?" she asked. "That's the problem," the Admiral said, swiping to bring up a satellite map. "They were supposed to rendezvous at predetermined coordinates, but those are now compromised. We need someone who can find them and bring them out, even if it means improvising the entire operation from the ground up." The map showed a labyrinth of small islands and shipping channels, each one potentially hiding Chinese patrol boats or surface-to-air missiles. It was the kind of operational environment that would give most pilots nightmares, but Valentina found herself calculating approach angles and escape routes with the automatic precision of someone who had never stopped thinking tactically. "Aircraft?" she asked. "Your choice from available inventory," Admiral Hawthorne said, "within reason. I'll need something fast and maneuverable, low radar signature, extended range." She looked up from the tablet. "And I'll need complete operational authority, no radio contact with command unless I initiate it, no oversight, no second-guessing." "Done." The speed of his agreement told her more about the situation's urgency than any briefing could. In the normal chain of command, such autonomy would require weeks of paperwork and committee approvals. The fact that he could grant it immediately meant that someone very important was willing to break protocol to get those operatives home. "When?" she asked. "Tonight, wheels up at 2100 hours. He closed the tablet and returned it to his jacket. "There's one more thing, Kozlov. If this goes wrong, if you're captured or killed, there will be no official acknowledgement, no rescue mission, no body recovery." Valentina nodded, unsurprised. Understood. But if I bring them back, what then? Do I disappear again, or do I finally get to exist? The Admiral's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been regret. That depends on how clean the extraction is. Success has a way of opening doors that failure keeps locked forever. She stood and moved toward the conference room door, then paused with her hand on the handle. One question, Admiral. The person who flagged my arrest, who was it? Someone who believes that talent should never be wasted, he said. Someone who spent 15 years making sure your real service record stays classified instead of buried. As the door closed behind her, Valentina found herself walking through corridors that no longer felt hostile, but rather familiar, like paths she had walked in dreams. The base around her hummed with the constant activity of a military installation, but underneath that surface noise, she could feel something else. The electric tension that preceded operations where everything mattered and nothing was guaranteed. The flight line stretched before her in the late afternoon sun, aircraft of various types arranged with military precision. Mechanics moved between the planes with practiced efficiency, their tools glinting in the golden light. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid filled her nostrils, triggering memories of missions both successful and costly, reminders of why she had once been considered one of the best pilots of her generation. A young airman approached, his uniform crisp despite the day's work. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Rodriguez. I've been assigned as your crew chief." His eyes took in her civilian clothes and scarred face with barely concealed curiosity. "I have your aircraft ready for inspection, if you'd like to take a look." She followed him across the tarmac to where a sleek aircraft waited, its angular lines speaking of stealth technology and advanced avionics. It was smaller than she'd expected, but perfectly suited for the kind of mission she'd been asked to undertake. As they walked around the plane, Rodriguez's professional demeanor gradually shifted to something approaching respect as she asked questions that revealed deep technical knowledge. "She's been modified for extended-range operations," he explained, opening an access panel to show additional fuel tanks. Electronic warfare suite has been updated to current standards, and the engines have been tuned for minimal acoustic signature. Valentina ran her hand along the aircraft's skin, feeling the slight texture that indicated stealth coating. "Weapons. Defensive only, ma'am. Countermeasures and electronic jammers. This bird is built for getting in and out without being noticed." She nodded, understanding the implications. This would be a mission of precision rather than force, success measured not by targets destroyed but by lives preserved. It was the kind of flying that had always suited her best, even when her superiors had been more interested in her ability to destroy than to save. "I'll need the aircraft fueled and ready in 3 hours," she said. "Full electronic countermeasures suite activated, and Rodriguez," she fixed him with a steady gaze. "What you see tonight, what you hear on the radio, it doesn't exist tomorrow. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." His response carried the weight of someone who understood that some operations existed in spaces between official recognition and plausible denial. "She'll be ready." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Valentina made her way to the base's operations center, where weather reports and intelligence updates would give her the information she needed to survive the next 12 hours. The corridors she walked were filled with personnel going about their duties, unaware that somewhere in the labyrinth of classified operations, decisions were being made that might change everything. The ops center buzzed with controlled activity, multiple screens displaying information from around the globe. A lieutenant commander looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition as someone whispered her call sign. She had forgotten how quickly word traveled in military circles, especially when it involved someone whose reputation had survived 15 years of official silence. "Commander Kozlov," he said, standing, "I have your weather briefings and the latest intelligence updates from the operational area." She accepted the tablet he offered, scrolling through data that painted a picture of challenging conditions and significant risks. The weather would be marginal, with storm systems moving through the area that could provide cover, but also create dangerous flying conditions. Chinese naval activity had increased, with patrol boats operating in patterns that suggested heightened alert status. "What about satellite coverage?" she asked. "Intermittent," the lieutenant commander replied. "We'll have windows of visibility, but you'll be operating mostly on your own navigation and targeting systems." It was what she had expected but hoped to avoid. Flying in hostile airspace without reliable intelligence support was like performing surgery blindfolded, possible for someone with sufficient skill and experience, but never advisable. She memorized the patrol patterns and timing windows, building a mental map of the operational environment that would guide her decisions in the hours ahead. "Thank you, Commander," she said, returning the tablet. "I won't need further updates unless the situation changes dramatically." As she left the ops center, Valentina felt the familiar weight of pre-mission focus settling over her like a comfortable jacket. The world around her began to narrow, unnecessary details fading as her mind automatically prioritized the information she would need to survive. It was a psychological shift she remembered from her active duty days, the transformation from everyday person to operational asset that had once defined her entire identity. The base chapel was nearly empty when she entered, its stained glass windows casting colored patterns across the wooden pews. She wasn't particularly religious, but she had long ago learned the value of quiet moments before dangerous missions. Not for prayer exactly, but for the kind of mental preparation that meant the difference between success and failure when everything went wrong. She sat in the back pew, her hands folded in her lap, and let her mind walk through the mission parameters one more time. 3 operatives to extract from hostile territory. No backup, no support, no official recognition if things went sideways. It was the kind of mission that had once been routine, back when she had been young enough to believe that skill and determination were sufficient to overcome any obstacle. Now, older and marked by experience, she understood that survival often came down to luck as much as ability. The difference was that she had learned to create her own luck through preparation and adaptability, to stack the odds in her favor by thinking 3 moves ahead of her enemies. It was a hard-won wisdom that had cost her career but might now save lives. The chapel's silence was broken by footsteps, and she looked up to see Admiral Hawthorne entering. He slid into the pew beside her, his presence comfortable rather than intrusive. They sat together without speaking for several minutes, 2 people who had seen enough of war to understand that some moments required silence rather than words. "Second thoughts?" he asked eventually. "Always," Valentina replied, "but not about going, about whether I'm still good enough to bring them home." "You wouldn't be here if there was any doubt about that," the Admiral said. "The question is whether you're ready to come back, really come back, not just for one mission." She turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that suggested this conversation was about more than a single extraction operation. "What aren't you telling me, Admiral?" "The world is changing, Kozlov, faster than most people realize. The old ways of doing things, the old assumptions about who our enemies are and how conflicts will be fought, all of that is being rewritten." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "We need people who can adapt, who can operate in gray areas where the rules haven't been written yet. And you think I'm one of those people. I know you are. The question is whether you're willing to accept that the mission tonight isn't just about 3 operatives. It's about proving that experience and judgment still matter in a world that's increasingly focused on technology and protocol." The implications of his words settled over her like a weight. This wasn't just about redemption or proving herself worthy of the insignia she wore. It was about demonstrating that there was still value in the kind of operator she had always been, someone who could think independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and make life-or-death decisions without committee approval. "I understand," she said finally. "I won't let you down." "You never have," Admiral Hawthorne replied, standing. "That's why you're here." After he left, Valentina remained in the chapel for a few minutes longer, listening to the distant sounds of aircraft operations filtering through the walls. Somewhere out there, 3 people were depending on her to find them and bring them home. The weight of that responsibility was familiar, even welcome after years of flying missions where the stakes were measured in cargo delivered rather than lives saved. She stood and made her way toward the flight line, where her aircraft waited in the gathering dusk. The base around her continued its constant activity, but she moved through it like a ghost, focused entirely on the task ahead. Personnel who noticed her passage whispered to each other, passing along fragments of her legend that had survived 15 years of official silence. The aircraft looked different in the evening light, its stealth coating giving it an almost ethereal appearance, as if it existed somewhere between the real world and the shadows. Rodriguez was making final checks, his movements precise and professional. When he saw her approaching, he straightened with the automatic respect that skilled personnel reserved for someone they recognized as equally competent. "She's ready, ma'am," he reported. "All systems green, full fuel load, countermeasures suite-tested and operational." Valentina walked around the aircraft one final time, her trained eye checking details that others might miss. Everything looked perfect, which somehow made her more nervous rather than less. Perfect equipment and perfect conditions often meant that the universe was preparing to test her with imperfect circumstances. "Thank you, Rodriguez," she said. "Now forget you ever saw me." "Saw who, ma'am?" He replied with a slight smile that suggested he understood the game they were all playing. As she climbed into the cockpit, Valentina felt the familiar embrace of an environment designed around her capabilities. The seat molded itself to her body, the controls fell naturally under her hands, and the displays came alive with information that would guide her through the next several hours. It was like putting on a favorite piece of clothing after years of wearing ill-fitting alternatives. The pre-flight checklist was routine, each item confirmed with automatic precision that spoke of thousands of hours of similar preparations. But underneath the familiar procedures, she could feel the electric anticipation that preceded missions where everything mattered. Her hands moved across the controls with fluid confidence, muscle memory, overriding the years of civilian flying that had never quite satisfied the part of her soul that needed meaningful purpose. "Tower, this is Viper 1, requesting departure clearance," she said into her headset, using her old call sign without conscious thought. "Viper 1, you are cleared for departure. Godspeed." The response carried an unusual informality that told her word of her mission had spread through the air traffic control system. In normal operations, such personal wishes would have been forbidden, but tonight was clearly not a normal operation. She advanced the throttles and felt the aircraft respond with eager power, ready to carry her toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. As the runway lights blurred past and the aircraft lifted into the night sky, Valentina felt the familiar transformation that occurred every time she left the ground. The weight of earthbound concerns fell away, replaced by the pure focus that came with three-dimensional thinking and life-or-death decisions measured in seconds rather than minutes. She was no longer a grounded pilot carrying the burden of an unofficial existence. She was Viper, call sign earned through skill and confirmed through survival. The lights of the base fell away below as she climbed toward cruise altitude, navigation systems automatically adjusting course toward coordinates that appeared on no official flight plan. Behind her, Rodriguez would be securing the maintenance logs that contained no record of her departure. Ahead lay international waters, hostile territory, and 3 people whose lives depended on her ability to remember skills she had spent 15 years trying to forget. The aircraft's communication system crackled with routine traffic from commercial flights following established airways, their crews unaware that they shared the sky with someone flying toward a mission that officially didn't exist. Valentina monitored the chatter with half her attention, while the rest of her mind focused on the tactical situation waiting ahead. Weather reports indicated the storm systems were developing as predicted, providing potential cover, but also creating navigation challenges that would test every aspect of her flying ability. As she settled into the rhythm of long-distance flight, Valentina allowed herself to remember why she had once loved this work. Not the violence or the danger, but the pure challenge of solving complex problems under pressure, of using skill and judgment to achieve objectives that mattered. For 15 years, she had flown missions where success was measured in on-time deliveries and customer satisfaction. Tonight, success would be measured in lives preserved and promises kept. The coastline passed beneath her, marked by scattered lights that gradually gave way to the empty darkness of open ocean. Soon, she would be beyond the range of friendly radar, operating in the gray areas where official authority meant less than personal competence. It was a familiar environment, one that had once defined her professional identity before politics and protocol had forced her into exile. Her aircraft's electronic warfare systems began detecting radar signatures from distant installations, painting a picture of layered defenses that would challenge any conventional approach. But Valentina had never been conventional, and the aircraft beneath her had been designed for precisely this kind of infiltration mission. She adjusted her course slightly, threading between detection zones with the precision of someone who understood that survival often depended on being exactly where enemies didn't expect. The night stretched ahead, filled with challenges and uncertainties that would test everything she had learned about flying, fighting, and staying alive in hostile environments. But for the first time in 15 years, Valentina felt completely herself, not a civilian contractor or a forgotten veteran, but a warrior whose skills were needed and whose presence could make the difference between success and tragedy. Whatever waited in the darkness ahead, she was ready to face it with the confidence that came from finally being exactly where she belonged. The first hint of trouble came as a subtle shift in the electronic warfare display, patterns of radar coverage that didn't match the intelligence briefings she'd memorized hours earlier. Valentina's eyes swept across the instrument panel, confirming what her instincts had already recognized. The Chinese naval presence had increased significantly since her departure. New contacts appeared on her passive sensors, patrol boats operating in coordination that suggested a heightened state of alert. She banked the aircraft slightly, adjusting her approach to take advantage of a weather front that was moving through the operational area. The storm cells would provide natural radar masking, but they would also create turbulence that would test both her flying skills and the aircraft's structural limits. It was a calculated risk, trading one danger for another in the eternal calculus of survival that defined special operations. "This is Viper 1, approaching operational area," she transmitted on the encrypted frequency reserved for the missing operatives. The radio carried only static in response, which could mean anything from equipment failure to enemy capture. She had expected this possibility, but it still sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning system. The storm front loomed ahead, its towering clouds illuminated by internal lightning that painted the darkness in brief, brilliant flashes. Valentina checked her harness and prepared for the buffeting that would come as she threaded her way through the weather system. The aircraft shuddered as it encountered the first turbulence, but its advanced flight control systems compensated automatically, maintaining course and altitude with electronic precision. Inside the clouds, visibility dropped to zero, forcing her to rely entirely on instruments while lightning strikes created temporary interference with her navigation systems. The aircraft bucked and rolled as conflicting air currents grabbed at its control surfaces, but Valentina's hands remained steady on the controls, making constant small adjustments that kept them on course despite the atmospheric violence surrounding them. When she finally broke through the far side of the storm, the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Her passive sensors now showed a complex pattern of naval vessels that suggested a coordinated search operation was underway. The missing operatives hadn't just failed to make their scheduled check-in. They had triggered a response that involved multiple Chinese naval units converging on the extraction zone. She reduced altitude, skimming just above the wave tops to minimize her radar signature while studying the tactical display. 3 patrol boats were operating in an expanding search pattern, their routes calculated to cover maximum area while maintaining mutual support. Between them, she could see the intermittent signatures of smaller craft that might be pursuing specific contacts rather than conducting random sweeps. The original extraction coordinates were clearly compromised, forcing her to rely on backup protocols that had been established for exactly this contingency. The operatives would know to move to alternate positions if their primary location became untenable, but finding them in the maze of small islands and shipping channels would require both skill and luck. She activated her aircraft's most sensitive sensors, scanning for any electronic signatures that might indicate friendly forces. A brief transmission caught her attention, lasting less than 2 seconds but carrying enough coded information to confirm that at least one of the operatives was still alive and mobile. The signal came from an island roughly 12 kilometers from the original extraction point, in an area that intelligence reports had marked as uninhabited. It was exactly the kind of location that trained operatives would choose for emergency rallying points, defensible, overlooked by enemy forces, but accessible to friendly extraction. Valentina banked toward the new coordinates, using the scattered islands to mask her approach while studying the patrol patterns of the Chinese vessels. The timing would be critical. She needed to reach the operatives during a gap in the search coverage, extract them quickly, and escape before the patrol boats could converge on her position. It was the kind of precision operation that left no margin for error or hesitation. As she approached the target island, her sensors detected movement on the shoreline that could have been enemy forces or might have been the people she was looking for. The ambiguity was maddening, but it was also typical of operations where the difference between success and catastrophe often came down to split-second decisions based on incomplete information. She circled the island at low altitude, using her aircraft's advanced optics to study the terrain and identify potential landing sites. The island was smaller than she had hoped, with rocky shores and dense vegetation that would complicate any extraction attempt. But there was a narrow beach on the northeastern side that might accommodate a quick landing if she approached from exactly the right angle. It would require flying between 2 rocky outcroppings with less than 50 feet of clearance on either side, but it was possible for someone with sufficient skill and steady nerves. Her radio crackled with another brief transmission, this one containing coordinates that matched her visual reconnaissance of the viable landing site. Someone on the ground was watching her approach and providing guidance, which meant at least one of the operatives retained functional communication equipment. It also meant they were competent enough to recognize the tactical requirements of the situation and adapt accordingly. Viper 1, 3 packages ready for pickup, came a whispered voice through her headset. The transmission was barely audible above the static, but it carried the professional calm of someone trained to operate under pressure. Be advised, we have company incoming from the south. Estimate 15 minutes before they reach this position. 15 minutes to complete an extraction from a beach that would challenge her flying abilities under the best of circumstances. Valentina felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied moments when everything depended on perfect execution. She had trained for scenarios like this, but training and reality were different things, separated by the unforgiving mathematics of physics and the unpredictable variables of human behavior under stress. She lined up her approach, using the aircraft's flight management system to calculate the precise glide path that would bring her to the beach with minimum exposure time. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than yards, requiring her to thread between the rocky outcroppings while compensating for crosswinds and the turbulence created by the island's topography. It was the kind of flying that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The aircraft descended through the night air with surgical precision, its engines adjusted to minimize acoustic signature while maintaining the power needed for rapid acceleration if the extraction went wrong. Valentina's hands moved across the controls with fluid confidence, making constant adjustments as she balanced the competing demands of stealth, speed, and safety. Below, she could see figures moving on the beach, positioning themselves for rapid boarding. Her landing lights illuminated the narrow strip of sand for just long enough to confirm that the beach was clear of obstacles, then switched off to preserve night vision and avoid attracting unwanted attention. The aircraft touched down with barely a bump, its advanced landing gear absorbing the impact as she applied reverse thrust to bring them to a stop in the shortest possible distance. 3 figures emerged from the vegetation and sprinted toward the aircraft, their movements coordinated despite the obvious stress of their situation. Valentina kept the engine spooled up and ready for immediate departure, while monitoring her sensors for any sign that their position had been detected. The extraction was proceeding smoothly, but she knew from experience that operations could go catastrophically wrong in the time it took to blink. The first operative reached the aircraft and climbed aboard with practiced efficiency, followed immediately by the second. But as the third figure approached, Valentina's threat warning system began chirping insistently, indicating radar contact from multiple sources converging on their position. The patrol boats had somehow detected their presence and were moving to intercept, turning what should have been a routine pickup into a race against rapidly closing enemies. "Go, go, go!" shouted the third operative as he tumbled into the aircraft, barely clearing the door before Valentina advanced the throttles to takeoff power. The aircraft lurched forward, accelerating down the beach while she fought to keep it centered on the narrow strip of sand between the rocks. Behind them, searchlights began sweeping the area as the Chinese patrol boats closed the distance with alarming speed. The aircraft lifted off just as the first searchlight beam swept across their previous position, climbing rapidly while Valentina banked hard to port to avoid the rocky outcropping that loomed ahead. Her passengers were thrown against their restraints by the violent maneuvering, but she had no choice except to prioritize escape over comfort. Getting shot down would be permanently uncomfortable for everyone involved. Tracer rounds began streaking past the aircraft as the patrol boats opened fire, their gunners trying to compensate for the difficulty of hitting a fast-moving target in poor visibility. Valentina threw the aircraft into a series of evasive maneuvers that tested the limits of both the airframe and her passengers' stomachs, using every trick she had learned about avoiding ground fire while maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of pursuit. Her electronic warfare systems detected multiple radar locks attempting to track her position, but the aircraft's stealth characteristics and electronic countermeasures created enough confusion to prevent accurate targeting. She flew between islands and under radar coverage, using the terrain to break lock-ons while gradually increasing the distance between her aircraft and the converging enemy forces. "Status report," she called back to her passengers once they had cleared the immediate danger zone. "Anyone hit? Any equipment that needs immediate attention?" "All 3 packages intact," came the response from the senior operative, a woman whose voice carried the kind of calm professionalism that Valentina remembered from her own special operations days. "We have critical intelligence that needs to reach command immediately. How long to friendly territory?" 2 hours if everything goes according to plan," Valentina replied, while privately calculating that the return flight would be significantly more challenging than the infiltration had been. The Chinese naval forces would now be actively hunting for her aircraft, and they would have had time to coordinate a response that covered multiple escape routes. "But given that nothing has gone according to plan so far, I'd estimate closer to 3. She settled into cruise configuration while studying the tactical display that showed enemy forces spreading out to cover the most likely egress routes. It was like looking at a chess board, where the opposing player had anticipated her moves and positioned pieces to block every obvious path to safety. But Valentina had never been interested in obvious paths, and the aircraft beneath her was designed for exactly this kind of situation. The storm front that had provided cover during her approach was now moving eastward, creating new possibilities for concealment while also generating weather conditions that would challenge her navigation systems. She adjusted course to follow the edge of the weather, using the radar interference created by precipitation to mask her signature, while avoiding the worst of the turbulence that could damage the aircraft or injure her passengers. Behind them, she could see the lights of search aircraft taking off from Chinese airfields, their pilots scrambling to join the hunt for an intruder who had successfully penetrated their security perimeter. It was a response that spoke to the value of the intelligence her passengers carried, information important enough to justify risking an international incident to prevent its escape. "What did you three find out there?" she asked, more to keep her passengers talking than from curiosity. People under stress often performed better when they had something to focus on besides their immediate danger, and maintaining communication helped her monitor their condition without taking her attention away from flying. "Naval expansion beyond anything in the intelligence estimates," the senior operative replied. "New submarine bases, advanced missile systems, coordination with other regional powers that changes the entire strategic balance." Her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications of what they had discovered. The kind of information that prevents wars by making sure everyone understands the actual stakes involved. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that justified the risks they were all taking, information that could save thousands of lives by preventing miscalculations born of ignorance. Valentina had participated in similar missions during her active duty career, operations where success was measured not by targets destroyed, but by conflicts prevented through superior understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. Her navigation display showed they were approaching the edge of Chinese territorial waters, but her passive sensors indicated that enemy search efforts were expanding beyond traditional boundaries. The pursuit aircraft were operating in patterns that suggested they were prepared to follow her into international airspace if necessary, turning the extraction into a potential diplomatic crisis that could have repercussions far beyond the immediate tactical situation. She adjusted her course again, this time heading for a corridor between two weather systems that would provide maximum concealment while keeping her in international waters. It was a narrow window that required precise timing, but it offered the best chance of avoiding both enemy interception and political complications that could compromise future operations. The aircraft flew through the night with mechanical precision, its systems operating flawlessly despite the stress of combat maneuvering and extended flight. But Valentina knew that mechanical reliability was only part of the equation. Human factors would ultimately determine whether they reached safety or became casualties of an operation that had already pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk. Her passengers had settled into the kind of alert calm that experienced operatives developed when there was nothing to do except wait and trust in the competence of people whose skills they couldn't directly evaluate. It was a familiar dynamic from her special operations days, the mutual dependence that developed between aircrew and ground forces who shared risks without sharing specialties. As they approached the halfway point of their return flight, Valentina's threat warning system detected new contacts ahead, aircraft operating in patrol patterns that blocked their most direct route to safety. The Chinese had anticipated her escape route and positioned interceptors to force her into a confrontation that could only end badly for an aircraft designed for stealth rather than air-to-air combat. She studied the tactical display, looking for gaps in the coverage that might allow her to slip through undetected. The patrol patterns were professional and thorough, but they were also predictable in the way that all systematic searches eventually became. If she could time her approach to coincide with the moment when the interceptors were at maximum separation, she might be able to thread between them before they could react. The maneuver would require split-second timing and perfect execution, with no margin for error or equipment failure. But it was possible, which meant it was necessary. The alternative was to attempt a longer route that would expose them to other threats while exhausting fuel reserves that were already lower than she preferred. Sometimes the most dangerous course was also the safest, a paradox that defined much of special operations flying. "Hold on," she warned her passengers. "Things are about to get interesting." The aircraft dove toward the wave tops as Valentina prepared for the most challenging phase of a flight that had already tested every aspect of her abilities. Behind them, the Chinese search effort continued with relentless efficiency. Ahead lay a gauntlet of enemy interceptors that stood between them and safety. And in her cargo bay rode 3 people whose intelligence could change the strategic balance in one of the world's most volatile regions. It was exactly the kind of mission that had once defined her life, the kind of challenge that required every skill she had developed over decades of flying in hostile environments. As she prepared for the final dash to safety, Valentina felt the familiar clarity that came with moments when everything mattered and nothing was certain except the need to perform flawlessly under pressure. The night sky ahead looked empty and peaceful, giving no hint of the deadly game of cat and mouse that was about to unfold among the clouds and stars. But appearances had always been deceiving in this business, and Valentina had learned long ago to trust her instruments and her instincts rather than what her eyes showed her. Tonight, both would be tested to their limits.